The moon is high above the cliffs of Middle Egypt, and the desert has cooled. Along the pale face of the rock, a royal family once stood beneath the rays of the sun. Their figures were cut into great boundary stelae, marking the sacred limits of a new city. Yet when the light moves softly across the stone, it finds wounds everywhere. A face has been hammered away. A name has been broken. Titles meant to endure for eternity have been reduced to shallow scars. Below the cliffs lies the plain of Amarna, quiet now, except for wind moving over sand and scattered stone. Here and there, the remains of walls trace the streets of a vanished capital. Elsewhere, blocks from its temples were carried away and hidden inside the monuments of later kings. The city did not simply fall into ruin. Its memory was dismantled. At the centre of that memory stood a pharaoh born as Amenhotep, who later called himself Akhenaten. For a brief span in the 14th century before our era, he altered the sacred language of Egypt, raised the visible sun above the familiar gods, changed the image of kingship, and built an entire city on open desert ground. Then, after his death, the old order returned. His monuments were taken apart. His successors were omitted from official histories. His name, the name by which an Egyptian hoped to live forever, became something dangerous to preserve. Why did Egypt try so carefully to forget him? Was Akhenaten a visionary of light, a ruler tightening the bonds between god and crown, an iconoclast who disrupted lives and temples, or some uneasy combination of all three? The surviving evidence will not give us a simple answer. It arrives in fragments: a hand at the end of a sunbeam, a letter pressed into clay, a painted floor beneath dust, a royal face deliberately struck. Hello, dear listener. Settle into whatever quiet place has found you tonight. Let your breathing slow, and allow the noise of the present to recede. If you would like, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and whether it is night around you too. Our path will follow the Nile into an age of wealth and ceremony, then turn east toward temples flooded with sunlight. We will walk beside kings, queens, priests, builders, officials, and ordinary families drawn into a royal experiment. We will look closely at faith and power, at startling art and intimate household images, at diplomacy, grief, abandonment, and the long work of erasure. And because certainty is rare at Amarna, we will pause when the record falls silent. For now, imagine the damaged name beneath the moon. To understand why it was attacked, we must first return to the brilliant Egypt that Akhenaten inherited, before anyone knew that its ancient balance was about to shift. The Egypt awaiting the young prince was neither weary nor obscure. In the later years of the 18th dynasty, it stood among the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Its southern authority reached deep into Nubia, where gold and tribute moved northward along the river. Across the Levant, local rulers maintained uneasy relationships with the Egyptian court. Ships and caravans carried timber, metal, luxury goods, and diplomatic gifts. Foreign kings wrote to one another as brothers, even when rivalry lay beneath their courteous words. At the summit of this world stood Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father. His reign, lasting close to 4 decades, projected a mood of abundance and assurance. Colossal statues watched over his vast memorial temple on the western bank at Thebes. At Luxor, new courts and graceful columns extended a sacred landscape already shaped by generations of kings. Farther south, at Soleb in Nubia, another great temple proclaimed royal presence beneath a harder sun. Scarabs carrying news of royal marriages, hunts, and building works spread carefully fashioned images of the king through the court and beyond it. This was an age of polished stone, fine gold, blue faience, carved ivory, and painted plaster. But royal magnificence should not make the whole land seem effortlessly rich. Egypt's grandeur rested upon fields measured after the flood. taxes gathered into storehouses, goods transported by boat, and labour summoned for estates and monuments. Most people lived close to the rhythms of cultivation. They watched the river rise, tended animals, repaired mud brick walls, and ground grain while distant temples accumulated treasure. The golden surface of empire was supported by countless ordinary hands. Its sacred world was equally vast. We often speak of the Egyptian gods as though they belonged to one fixed and orderly list, but ancient religion was more layered than that. A town might honour a local deity with particular affection, while also recognizing gods worshipped throughout the country. Divine beings could merge in name and character, without losing every separate identity. A god might appear in several forms, bear many titles, or become closely linked with another across time. Household devotions, local shrines, state festivals, funerary customs, and royal temple rites overlapped, without needing to fit a single exclusive creed. In the darkness of a sanctuary, a cult image could receive clothing, incense, food, and words of ritual. Outside, festival processions brought the presence of a god into streets, bright with expectation. People gathered as sacred barks passed, musicians played, and priests moved through the crowd. Such occasions were acts of worship, but they were also part of the social calendar, tying communities to place, memory, and one another. Among the most powerful divine names of the period was Amun, whose great centre at Karnak had grown with Egypt's imperial success. Joined with the solar god Re as Amun-Re, he could be praised as hidden and universal, a creator whose presence reached beyond any one image. Successive rulers enlarged his precinct. They raised pylons and obelisks, added courts, decorated walls, and granted land, livestock, workshops, personnel, and shares of conquered wealth to his temples. Karnak was therefore more than a collection of beautiful sacred buildings. It was the centre of an enormous institution. Its estates produced food. Its storehouses received goods. Scribes kept accounts. Brewers, bakers, weavers, farmers, craftsmen, boatmen, and servants supported its activity. Priests carried out rites on schedules arranged around the divine image and the ritual year. The institution possessed influence because it stood where devotion, land, labour, and royal patronage met. Yet it would be misleading to imagine the priests of Amun as a single secret force waiting to oppose the crown. Their wealth had largely been built through gifts from kings, and their highest offices existed within a system the king helped to order. Temple and palace depended upon one another, even when their interests could differ. Nor was Amun the only god with an established priesthood, property, or regional importance. The religious landscape was crowded with durable relationships that had developed over centuries. The pharaoh occupied the essential point between these worlds. He was the earthly ruler who maintained Ma'at, the rightness, balance, and order upon which society and the cosmos were thought to depend. Temple walls showed him offering to the gods, receiving life and authority in return, or defeating the forces of chaos. In practice, priests performed daily ceremonies in his name across the country. In image and theology, however, it was always the king who served as Egypt's ideal ritual actor. This arrangement gave kingship a sacred authority, but it also placed a heavy obligation upon it. Flood, harvest, foreign security, temple service, justice, and succession could all be understood within the broad promise of order. A ruler did not govern a state that happened to possess a religion. The work of ruling and the work of sustaining the divine world were woven together. Amenhotep III seems to have explored that sacred authority with unusual intensity. Solar imagery grew prominent around his kingship, and late in the reign the king was presented in strongly divine terms. The sun had always been central to Egyptian thought, appearing through several gods and theological traditions. Re, Horakti, Amun-Re, and the physical sun known as the Aten could coexist within that wider field. Nothing about honouring sunlight was yet a rejection of Egypt's other gods. Beside Amenhotep the Ride stood Queen Ti, his great royal wife and the mother of the future Akhenaten. Her parents were not themselves king and queen, yet Ti came to occupy a conspicuous place in royal representation. She appeared by the king in monumental images and was known at foreign courts. A large commemorative scarab announced her name and family alongside the king's, making her identity part of the official image of the reign. Her prominence offers a quiet prelude to the still more visible ritual role later taken by Nefertiti. Of the prince who would become Akhenaten, far less can be said. He was born Amenhotep, a name honouring Amun, and was a younger son of Amenhotep III and Ti. The evidence for his childhood is sparse. We cannot confidently reconstruct his education, his early religious convictions, or his private relationship with the powerful institutions around him. Royal children would have grown amid courtiers, tutors, rituals, and the disciplined habits of palace life, but surviving monuments do not open a window onto his thoughts. Even the path by which he approached the throne is shadowed by gaps. The king had an older son, Thutmose, who held priestly and military titles but disappeared from the record before the succession. Amenhotep remained. At some point in the middle of the 14th century before our era, after the long and imposing reign of his father, the younger man inherited not merely wealth and territory, but an intricate covenant between crown, country, and gods. The stillness of that inheritance can be deceptive when viewed from so far away. The temples appeared permanent. Amun's name was cut deep into stone. Festival routes had been travelled for generations. The palace spoke in an ancient language of rule. Yet within this confident system were many currents: royal solar theology, local loyalties, temple wealth, international competition, family ambition, and the constant need to make divine order visible. The coming transformation did not begin with one sudden declaration, nor can it be reduced to a simple contest between a pharaoh and a priesthood. It began inside the inherited forms themselves. A new king took an old royal name. He entered the established ceremonies, and then, beside the immense precinct of Amun at Karnak, he began to build for the light of the sun. He came to the throne as Amenhotep IV, the fourth king of that name, probably in the middle decades of the 14th century before our era. Egyptian chronology does not yield one universally accepted modern date, and scholars continue to debate whether he ruled briefly alongside his father or succeeded him only after death. What is clear is that the new king first appeared within the traditions of the dynasty. His throne name invoked the ordered manifestations of Re. His birth name still declared that Amun was satisfied. The familiar language of kingship had not yet been cast aside. The beginning of any reign required continuity. Officials needed confirmation in their offices. Temple rites continued. Taxes, provisions, quarrying expeditions, and foreign correspondence did not pause while one king replaced another. Images of royal authority had to be carved, and the divine order renewed in the name of its new guardian. For a young ruler following Amenhotep III's exceptionally long reign, the past must have been present in every ceremonial space, though the monuments tell us nothing certain about how that inheritance felt to him. At his side was Nefertiti, his great royal wife. Her family origins remain uncertain, and later fame has encouraged more confident stories about her than the evidence permits. In the record of the reign itself, however, her importance is unmistakable. She was not kept at the edge of official scenes. She accompanied the king in worship, appeared beneath the rays of the Aten, and performed gestures that proclaimed active royal power. In some images she made offerings on her own. In others, her figure approached the king's in scale and prominence. Egyptian queens had long held sacred roles, and Queen Tiye had already been represented with unusual distinction. Even so, Nefertiti's visibility became extraordinary. Her changing crowns marked different ritual identities. At times a tall, flat-topped blue crown, at times forms associated with queenship and the divine. The couple's daughters would also enter the sacred picture, turning the royal household itself into part of the new theology. That development lay ahead. In the early years, the first unmistakable sign of change rose not in a remote new capital, but at Thebes, close to the old power of Karnak. There Amenhotep V ordered major buildings for the Aten. The word Aten could refer to the sun's visible disk, and the Aten had appeared in Egyptian religious language long before this king was born. Solar theology had deep roots. Amenhotep III's reign had already given heightened attention to the sun and to the divine radiance of kingship. The young pharaoh did not discover an unknown god. He selected, intensified, and gradually transformed an existing aspect of the sacred world. This distinction matters. Revolutions often look complete when viewed backward, after later events have given them a sharp outline. To those living through the first years of Amenhotep IV, a royal temple for a solar deity could still be understood within Egypt's capacious traditions. Kings had always built for gods. The Aten could initially stand alongside other divine forms. Only over time did official worship narrow, and only later did the names and images of certain gods become targets. The scale and urgency of the early project nevertheless suggested that more than routine patronage was underway. East of the established precinct of Amun-Re, where the morning sun reached the ground, new sanctuaries spread across a broad area. One bore a name often rendered as the Gempar Aten, the place where the Aten was found. Other structures honoured the royal family in relation to the sun. Much of this complex was later dismantled, so its original arrangement must be recovered from foundations, fragments, inscriptions and blocks reused in subsequent construction. Those blocks are known today as talatat. Smaller than the massive stones common in traditional monumental building, they could be handled efficiently by teams of workers and laid in rapid courses. Their regular dimensions helped speed construction and gave artists convenient surfaces for carved scenes. Wall after wall could rise while the rain itself was still finding its new visual language. Imagine the work at the edge of Karnak, sandstone arriving, dust lifting around ropes and sledges, masons fitting block to block, draftsmen marking lines, and carvers following close behind. These are not records of a single observed day, but the materials and organization are preserved in the remains. A new sacred landscape was being assembled quickly under the open sky, even as the old temples continued their rites nearby. The design of Aten worship turned toward light. Traditional sanctuaries often led inward through courts and halls toward a smaller, darker, restricted chamber. The Aten, as visible solar presence, required no statue hidden in such darkness. Its temples emphasized open courts, where sunlight could fall directly upon altars and offerings. Architecture was becoming theology, not simply a container for ritual, but a way of allowing the gods' rays to touch the ritual space. The Aten itself also took on a distinctive official form. Earlier solar imagery could show a falcon-headed deity crowned with a disk. During Amenhotep IV's reign, representation moved toward the disk in the sky, extending long rays downward. At the ends of those rays were small hands, some offering the sign of life to the nostrils of the king and queen. Light was no longer merely suggested. It reached, held, blessed, and animated. At the centre of this contact stood the royal pair. The Aten's rays touched Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti, while they presented offerings in return. This elevated the family as the privileged meeting point between divine light and the human world. In later years, that mediation would become one of the defining features of Atenism. Ordinary people could see the royal household worshipping under the sun, but official access to the Aten was increasingly expressed through the king and queen. The pace of change can also be felt in an unusual royal jubilee celebrated early in the reign. Such festivals traditionally renewed a king's power after a long period of rule, though they were not governed by an entirely rigid schedule. Amenhotep V held one far sooner than the customary 30-year association would lead us to expect. The surviving scenes place the Aten at the centre and show the king performing ceremonies of renewal. Whether the festival answered a specific political need, followed a precedent of his father, or announced a fresh theological age cannot be known with certainty. Its early appearance, however, adds to the sense of acceleration. The king's image was changing as well. Some early works still belonged to the elegant manner of Amenhotep III's court. Then royal faces lengthened. Bodies became narrow at the shoulders and fuller at the belly and hips. Features were drawn into sweeping lines, and movement entered scenes that had once seemed more restrained. These images have often tempted modern observers to diagnose the king's body or health, but stylized royal art is not a medical record. The forms may carry theological meaning, represent an artistic program, preserve some degree of likeness, or combine several intentions that can no longer be separated. What matters here is that the alteration was public and deliberate. Colossal figures set the transformed king before viewers on a monumental scale. Reliefs multiplied through the fast-built walls. Nefertiti appeared again and again as a partner in ritual. The new style did not abandon every Egyptian convention. Scale, pose, inscription, and the ordered registers of temple art continued to communicate rank and sacred action. Yet those conventions were being stretched into something immediately recognizable as different. Still, Amenhotep V had not yet become Akhenaten. The city of Amarna had not yet risen. Amen's cult had not yet suffered the systematic attack that would come later. In these first years, the future remained open, and perhaps that is the best way to see the young king, not as a finished symbol, but as a ruler moving with gathering speed through inherited forms. Beside Karnak, the new walls caught the dawn. Offerings waited on open altars. Above the royal family, the disk extended its many hands, each ray descending through clear air. Egypt had always watched the sun return. Under Amenhotep V, it was beginning to look as though the sun would soon ask for the whole horizon. And as that horizon widened, the Aten became more difficult to place beside the old gods. The sun disk was the round brilliance visible above the earth, not an unseen being hidden beyond creation. Warmth on stone, white light on river water, the force behind growth, breath, and each returning day. In official art, that presence took a disciplined form. Long rays descended from the disk and ended in small hands, some bearing gifts, others reaching toward the king and queen, one offering the sign of life beneath their noses. The image made light itself appear to animate the world. This image told theology without requiring a hidden statue. The Aten was high above, touching all that lived, but its most intimate contact was with the royal family. Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti stood beneath the rays, presenting food, incense, flowers, and the wealth of Egypt. The light answered with life and authority. In older temple scenes, a king might approach many gods in their separate forms, each dwelling in a sanctuary, and each sustaining a part of the ordered world. Here the exchange narrowed toward one radiant source, and toward one royal household, through which that source became knowable. The surviving hymns and inscriptions praised the Aten as creator and sustainer, awakening animals, opening eyes, filling the riverlands with life, and shining even upon distant countries. They speak with a breadth that can feel startling. All people stand beneath the same sun. Birds leave their nests when it rises. Plants grow, infants breathe, and ships travel their courses. The theology dwelt less upon old tales of divine conflict and succession than upon the visible miracle of existence renewed at dawn. Night became an absence of the Aten's light, morning the world's restoration. Yet the apparent simplicity conceals a strict structure. The Aten could shine over everyone, but official worship increasingly passed through the king. The royal family did not merely serve the god on behalf of Egypt. In image after image, They occupied the privileged space beneath the life-giving rays. Court officials praised the Aten, and also declared loyalty to the king who understood him. In private tombs, rewards and hopes were bound to royal favour. The light was universal, but its authorized meaning was concentrated. This is one reason modern labels must be used carefully. Akhenaten's religion is often described as the first monotheism, a phrase that gives it a familiar place in a much later story. But the evidence does not fit neatly inside one word. Monotheism may suggest a belief that only one god exists. Monolatry can describe the worship of one god without necessarily denying all others. Henotheism may refer to the elevation of one deity above the rest. Each term illuminates part of the change, and each can also obscure the language and institutions of ancient Egypt. The reforms themselves did not remain fixed. Early in the reign, other gods still appeared and continued to receive cult. Over time, official expression became more exclusive. The Aten's elaborate formal name was enclosed in cartouches like a royal name, giving the god a kind of kingship. Certain older divine forms disappeared from new royal monuments. The plural word for gods became troublesome in some contexts. Eventually, names and images associated with Amun, and in places Mute, would be attacked. The process unfolded by stages, and the surviving evidence is uneven. A wall carved in one year may preserve an accommodation that a wall of a later year has abandoned. Nor can state theology be treated as a complete record of private belief. Temples tell us what the crown funded and proclaimed. Tomb inscriptions reveal the hopes of people close enough to court to prepare decorated burials. Decrees show what authority wished to establish. They do not allow us to look directly into every household. A farmer working beside a canal, a woman tending a family shrine, or a soldier far from Thebes may have understood the new doctrine in ways that were never carved in stone. Later evidence from the new capital would show that familiar religious habits did not simply vanish because royal language had changed. To feel the narrowing, it helps to remember what the older sacred world offered. Egyptian gods were not merely names on an official list. They belonged to places, stories, seasons, illnesses, births, journeys, and deaths. Amun moved in festival procession from Karnak, his shrine carried through streets crowded with sound and expectation. Hathor could embody music, beauty, welcome, and the dangerous power of the sun. Biz protected homes and childbirth. Tauret watched over vulnerable mothers and infants. Osiris gave form to hopes of renewal after death. Local gods tied a town to its landscape and its ancestors. Their myths made the universe personal. Isis searched for Osiris. Horus inherited and defended rightful order. The sun god crossed the dangerous night and returned. Such stories did more than explain the world. They offered recognizable patterns of loss, endurance, protection, and rebirth. Festivals brought these powers beyond temple walls. Processions filled roads and riverbanks. Oracles could answer questions. Music, food, scent, colour, and collective memory turned theology into a lived calendar. As official Atenism pushed these forms aside, something emotionally dense was being removed from public life. The Aten offered light, creation, and the immediate abundance of the visible world, but no comparable family of gods with intertwined stories. Its image was deliberately unlike an animal or a human body. The disk did not walk through a myth or speak in a dramatic tale. It shone. The king interpreted. The ritual presented abundance beneath the rays. For some, this may have possessed a severe beauty. An open court at dawn, the air still cool. Hundreds of offerings receiving the first light. The scene joined worship to an event repeated across the whole earth. There was no need to awaken a statue in darkness, dress it, and carry it out. The god arrived across every wall at once. Stone, bread, Flowers, priests, and royal bodies were made visible by the very power being adored. For others, though the record does not preserve their voices clearly, the change may have felt like distance rather than nearness. The Aten's rays touched the earth, yet the small hands in official art reached most tenderly toward the royal pair. Familiar, divine faces were absent. The old pathways into death and renewal became less prominent. A household might still whisper an inherited prayer, but the great resources of the state were moving elsewhere. Even the language of creation changed its center of gravity. Instead of a complex divine society extending across sky, earth, underworld, city, and village, the crown presented a world continuously dependent on light. Instead of many sacred images receiving royal attention, one image gathered authority. And instead of the king maintaining balance among numerous temples, the king increasingly appeared as the singular knower of the Aten. We cannot know whether every viewer understood this as a revolution while it was happening. A temple worker might first have noticed a new assignment, a scribe, a new formula, a priest, a lost allocation of grain, a courtier, a new posture of praise. Great transformations often enter daily life as smaller adjustments, until the old pattern can no longer be recovered without looking back. By then, the sunlight on the walls at Karnak was falling upon a sacred order already separating from its surroundings. The Aten had begun as a presence that might still be placed within Egypt's crowded heavens. It was becoming the center around which the heavens themselves were redrawn. And beneath its many reaching hands the bodies of the king, the queen, and their children were about to become the most visible signs of all. Those royal bodies did not resemble the serene, broad-shouldered forms that had long promised timeless strength. On colossal statues raised for the early Aten complex at Karnak, Amenhotep V appeared with an elongated face, heavy eyelids, full lips, narrow chest, rounded belly, and broad hips. The limbs could seem slender while the torso curved in unexpected ways, at monumental scale. These were not details a visitor might overlook. They formed a new royal presence in stone. Modern observers have repeatedly tried to turn that presence into a diagnosis. Different conditions have been proposed to explain the shape of the skull, the hips, the face, or the apparent blending of masculine and feminine traits. Yet the statues were works of sacred kingship, not clinical portraits. Egyptian artists had always shaped the royal body according to ideas of authority, youth, fertility, and divine order. Akhenaten's images may contain elements of individual likeness, but they also belong to an organized artistic program. No illness can be established merely by measuring a carved figure, and attempts to do so often reveal more about modern expectations than about the king. The unusual form may have carried theological meaning. The Aten was praised as the source of all life, and the king stood as the god's principal earthly intermediary. A body combining narrowness and fullness, firmness and softness, could suggest creative completeness. Or the form may have emphasized the king's separation from ordinary humanity. It may also have grown from innovations already present late in Amenhotep III's reign. These possibilities need not exclude one another. The artists left powerful surfaces, but no surviving instruction explains them in a language certain enough to settle the question. Some of the colossi are especially enigmatic, because they appear without the customary kilt and lack clearly rendered male anatomy. They have been interpreted in several ways, as Akhenaten in a symbolic state, as a gendered theological image, or even as another member of the royal household. Certainty is elusive. What can be said is that the body of kingship had become a field upon which the new doctrine was made visible. The change extended beyond anatomy. Faces lengthened into flowing curves. Fingers became fine and tapered. Necks bent, bellies rested forward, and figures seemed to inhabit the moment rather than stand outside time. In relief, the king might lean toward an offering table piled with bread, flowers, birds, fruit and vessels. Nefertiti might mirror his action. Garments followed the line of a moving leg. Ribbons stirred behind a crown. The carved world felt more exposed to air and light. Most striking were scenes of the royal family together. The king and queen sat beneath the Aten's rays while their daughters climbed upon them, reached toward their faces or rested in their arms. Parents touched children. Small bodies turned and overlapped. A daughter might dangle from Nefertiti's lap, while another received the king's affection. Such images can seem private to modern eyes, like moments borrowed from a palace room, yet they were also public statements of theology. The royal household embodied the channel through which the Aten's life entered society. Intimacy itself became sacred evidence. The daughter's movements, the queen's presence, and the king's touch displayed vitality produced beneath the disk. What appears to be domestic tenderness was also a carefully arranged image of cosmic order. We should not use it as a transparent diary of family feeling, though genuine affection and formal meaning may have coexisted. Nefertiti's role was essential to this visual language. She was not merely positioned behind her husband. At times she matched him in gesture, offering directly to the Aten. Her tall crowns created a strong vertical shape beneath the descending rays, and her figure could carry the same elongated features as the king. The reform did not erase distinctions of rank or gender, but it granted the queen an unusually forceful place within royal ritual. Together, the couple formed a sacred pair, with their daughters gathering the promise of continuation around them. For all its novelty, this art still spoke Egyptian. Important figures remained larger than servants. Hieroglyphs identified people and acts. Scenes followed registers and used established poses of offering, worship, victory, and reward. The sun disk occupied a defined place above the royal action. Artists transformed inherited grammar rather than abandoning it. That continuity made the innovations legible. A viewer knew how to read a king before a god, even when the god had no body and the king's own body had been radically remade. Technique assisted the transformation. Sunk relief, cut into the surface rather than raised above it, suited exterior walls exposed to strong sunlight. Deep outlines held their shadows while the surrounding stone blazed. The Aten's rays could be incised in repeated lines, their tiny hands descending toward faces and offerings. Painted colour, now mostly lost, would have sharpened the effect. Blue crowns, warm skin, green leaves, bright vessels, and the disk above them. The small talatat blocks also encouraged speed and repetition. Scenes could spread rapidly through new courts, with teams carving adjacent surfaces as construction advanced. That speed did not imply carelessness. It allowed the royal program to occupy space at a pace matching the accelerating reform. Later, when these buildings were dismantled, the same small blocks would be carried away and buried inside other monuments, breaking grand compositions into thousands of fragments. Hands, lips, rays, flowers, and partial names would survive without their original neighbours. For the moment, however, the walls were new. Imagine their colours before desert wind and reuse wore them down. The royal family moved across them in long processions and quiet embraces. Above, the sun touched every carved figure, and below real visitors stood within the same light. The distinction between image and ritual must have seemed unusually thin. Art was not decorating a completed revolution. It was helping to create one. The altered body announced a transformed king. The family scenes showed where divine life was concentrated. The open courts made daylight a participant, and the incised rays carried its power across stone. Before the old order was attacked in words and names, another order had already become imaginable to the eye. Soon the king would place that change inside his own identity. The name that still declared Amon's satisfaction could not comfortably contain a world turning toward the Aten alone. The long face, the reaching rays, and the tender royal household had prepared the image. A new name would make the separation audible. Around the 5th year of the reign, perhaps moving into the 6th, Amenhotep V ceased to be the name displayed at the centre of Egypt's new religious vision. The king became Akhenaten. Ancient names carried declarations, loyalties and hopes, and a royal name was never a casual ornament. Amenhotep proclaimed, in a common modern rendering, that Ammon was satisfied. Akhenaten is often translated as effective for the Aten, or useful to the Aten, though Egyptian words allow shades of meaning that do not pass perfectly into English. The change announced more than personal preference. It altered the sentence the king's identity spoke whenever scribes wrote it or priests pronounced it. The timing matters. The new name appeared while Atenism was becoming more exclusive, yet before the full campaign against Amun's presence had reached its later intensity. The break was not one stroke made in a single morning. It gathered through altered titles, redirected building, new ritual forms, and a court increasingly centred upon the Aten. Only with distance do these changes join into a clean line. Still, changing the royal name made the line harder to cross back over. Amun was no longer carried within the pharaoh's public identity. The god whose vast precinct dominated Thebes, whose festivals filled its river and roads, and whose institutions had prospered under generations of kings, was omitted. In his place stood the visible disk, and the kings declared service to it. Thebes remained a sacred and administrative centre, crowded with monuments and sustained by estates, workshops, storehouses, docks and communities. It could not simply disappear. Yet royal attention began to move away from it. The Aten temples already stood near Karnak, exposed to the eastern sun. But even this dramatic construction had taken place beside the inherited capital of Ammon. For the reform to become complete in space as well as language, Akhenaten would seek ground beyond the old sacred map. Why he chose this course remains beyond recovery. Religious conviction is an obvious possibility, because the scale and persistence of the program are difficult to explain without taking its theology seriously. Royal control may also have mattered. Temples were not merely places of prayer. They held land, grain, herds, workshops, labour, and administrative networks. Redirecting patronage could redirect resources and dependence toward the crown. The reform also magnified an old principle of kingship, the pharaoh as essential mediator between humanity and the divine. None of these explanations gives us the private mind of Akhenaten. There is no surviving confession in which he sets out a motive recognizable to modern biography, nor is there reliable evidence for a simple secret struggle in which Amun's priests forced the king into revolution. Temple wealth, theology, court politics, royal ambition, inherited solar thought, and individual temperament may all have met within the change. The proportions cannot be measured now. What survives more clearly is the action. In the later years of the reign, workers attacked the name and image of Amun on accessible monuments. The chisels reached temple walls, royal inscriptions, and objects across Egypt, and the campaign extended south into Nubia. Amun's name could be cut from a cartouche that had once honoured a royal ancestor. Images of the god could be hammered away, leaving pale wounds in carved scenes. Even the plural writing of gods was sometimes avoided or altered. The name of Mut, Ammon's divine consort at Thebes, was also targeted in places. The destruction was wide, but not perfectly complete. Egypt's monuments were too numerous, its surfaces too hidden or remote, and its inscriptions too deeply woven into the past for every trace to be found. Some names escaped behind later masonry or in tombs less easily reached. Others were damaged inconsistently. Erasure depended upon access, orders, labour, and time. The remaining scars reveal a determined official campaign, not an all-seeing force capable of emptying every sanctuary at once. There was a bitter complexity in attacking Ammon's name. Egyptian tradition gave names a form of life. To preserve a name in speech and inscription helped preserve the being it identified. To remove it was therefore not only to edit a text, but to wound presence and memory. Akhenaten's agents were applying to a god the same logic that later kings would apply to Akhenaten himself. For temple communities, the consequences were material as well as sacred. A great cult depended on priests of many ranks, but also on bakers, brewers, scribes, gardeners, herders, boat crews, linen workers, metal workers, guards, singers, and sweepers. Offerings had to be grown, counted, transported, prepared, presented, redistributed, and recorded. When royal resources shifted, these interlocking lives shifted with them. Not every worker would simply have lost a place. Some labour and goods were redirected into Aten foundations. Masons who carved Amun could carve rays and royal names. Scribes could learn new formulas. Estates might send produce toward new altars. Officials followed the court. Yet reassignment was not emotionally neutral. A craft practiced within one sacred tradition now served another. A family linked to a temple for generations might find its status uncertain. Local economies felt decisions made in the language of heaven. Festivals, too, were more than lines in a ritual calendar. When Amun travelled from Karnak, crowds could watch the god's shrine pass, seek an oracle, receive food, meet relatives, trade goods, and participate in a shared memory of place. Restricting or neglecting such rites altered the rhythm of the city. Streets that had expected music and procession would have seemed different if the divine journey no longer came. The silence left by a cancelled festival cannot be excavated, but the institutions surrounding these events show how far their absence could reach. The new cult created its own abundance. Aten altars received bread, meat, flowers, fruit, incense, wine, and cool water under the sky. Priests and officials still served. Workshops still produced vessels and carved stone. The revolution did not abolish temple economy. It concentrated patronage into a new form, one bound closely to the royal family and to the visible sun. Across Egypt, however, observance likely changed unevenly. A decree could alter a temple inscription more quickly than it altered a family's inherited habits. Some people may have complied in their work and public language while continuing older forms of protection at home. The record is fragmentary, and the new capital will show that official exclusion and private practice did not always move together. At court, the language grew more absolute. Loyal officials described the king as the one who taught them, nourished them, and brought them into favour. Access to the Aten ran through royal knowledge, while access to advancement ran through the palace. Theology and government folded closely together. To honour the king's revelation was also to belong to the new order. The move away from Thebes therefore answered more than a desire for fresh scenery. Old cities carried old claims. Their temples possessed histories embedded in stone, and every sanctuary entered a landscape already crowded with divine memory. A place without an established great cult could be drawn more completely around the Aten and the king. There sunlight would not fall beside Ammon's pylons. It would define a sacred world from its first foundation line. Akhenaten's attention turned northward, along the river that joined palace, field, quarry, shrine, and distant border. Somewhere between Thebes and Memphis, the eastern cliffs opened into a broad desert bay. The pale ground held no ancient royal capital, and no dominant sanctuary of another god. At dawn, the sun rose between the ridges and laid its light across the empty plain. The choice of that place would deepen every rupture already underway. Officials, labourers, artists, priests, supplies, and whole households would be drawn toward it. The royal focus would leave the monumental weight of Thebes behind and fasten itself to a horizon not yet built. For now there was only desert, river wind, and the long curve of cliffs. but the king had begun to move toward them, carrying a new name and a god of open light. Into that empty bay came surveyors, stonecutters, scribes, and the royal court. Before streets crossed the dust, before mud-brick walls cast their first narrow shadows, the cliffs themselves were made to speak. On prominent faces of rock around the plain, workers cut great rectangular scenes and long columns of hieroglyphs. The Aten spread its rays above Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters. Beneath the carved family, the king proclaimed why this place had been chosen and marked out the land that would belong to his new city. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. The name joined landscape and theology. Seen from parts of the plain, the eastern ridges could frame the rising sun as though light were appearing through the sign for horizon. Whether that visual resemblance alone decided the choice cannot be known. The inscriptions offer a royal explanation, not a private diary. Yet the setting suited the faith with unusual precision. A broad open ground, an eastern cliff line washed by morning light, and a position in Middle Egypt between the older centres of Memphis and Thebes. The monuments, now known as the boundary stelae, gave the city a sacred geography. Some stood high in the eastern cliffs, others marked reaches across the river. Their words described limits, dedications, offerings, tombs, and the king's intention to build. In later renewals of the declaration, Akhenaten returned to the promise with solemn emphasis. The repeated language has sometimes been taken to mean that he swore never to pass beyond the marked territory. That older picture is too rigid. The wording and the wider evidence do not require us to imagine a pharaoh imprisoned inside his own horizon. The stelae defined a consecrated domain. They made the landscape part of a royal foundation act, fixing the city's meaning in stone even while its buildings were still rising from earth. Below them, construction began with remarkable speed. Akhenaten was not built from nothing in a single morning, however much its ideology favoured sudden beginnings. Materials had to be quarried, timber and stone brought by river, bricks moulded from Nile mud and straw, plaster mixed, pigments prepared, and food gathered for the workforce. The court summoned administrators, soldiers, priests of the Aten, artisans, labourers and their families. Boats unloaded supplies at the riverbank. Carts and carrying poles moved inland. Along the pale ground, foundation lines became walls, and walls became a city stretching for kilometres beside the Nile. Mudbrick allowed much of that growth to happen quickly. It could be shaped from local soil, dried in the sun, and laid with less delay than great blocks of dressed stone. Important doorways, columns, thresholds, and ritual structures received stone, while vast areas of palace, office, storehouse, and home rose in brick. Fresh plaster concealed rough surfaces. Floors and walls could be painted with pools, birds, plants, patterned textiles, and bright bands of colour. What now seems a low brown landscape of ruined outlines once held blue, green, red, and gold beneath an immense sky. The city did not form one perfect geometric plan. It developed as a long, loose settlement shaped by the river, the desert, and royal movement. At its centre stood the principal ceremonial and administrative buildings. A broad route, often called the Royal Road, linked palaces in the north with the central city. Along it the king and his household could appear in chariots, passing beneath the Aten's rays, while officials and residents watched. Movement itself became ceremony. Distance, dust, architecture, and the visible royal family all worked together to stage the new order. In the central district, the great palace faced a smaller royal residence across the road. A bridge connected parts of the complex above the route, allowing the household to move between private and official spaces. Nearby were offices, magazines, courts, workshops, and buildings through which grain, goods, documents, and favours could pass. Scribes kept the machinery of government moving, recording deliveries and correspondence in shaded rooms, while the theology outside celebrated unbounded light. Akhenaten may have proclaimed a new beginning, but it still required the old patient skills of an Egyptian state. Its most distinctive spaces were the temples of the Aten. Traditional Egyptian temples often drew a visitor inward through a sequence of increasingly restricted rooms. Bright outer courts gave way to shadow. The divine image rested in a sanctuary where only authorized ritual attendants could approach it. At Akhenaten, the governing image was different. The Aten was the sun visible above the world, and the temple opened itself to the sky. At the great Aten temple, gateways led through a long progression of open courts. Rows upon rows of offering tables filled the sacred space. Bread, beer, cattle, birds, flowers, fruit, incense, and other provisions could be arranged beneath direct sunlight. The scale was part of the message. Life was renewed by rays that reached every land, and Egypt answered with abundance gathered before the god. There was no need to carry the Aten out from a dark chamber in the form of a hidden statue. At dawn the divine presence arrived overhead. This openness did not make the religion socially open in the modern sense. Images still placed Akhenaten and Nefertiti at the heart of the exchange. The rays descended toward their faces and offerings, sometimes ending in small hands that held signs of life. Priests and servants performed the daily work, but the king and queen remained the chief interpreters and ritual partners of the Aten. Vast courts might stand under the common sky, while sacred authority narrowed around one household. A second important sanctuary, now called the Small Aten Temple, stood near royal and administrative quarters. Like its larger neighbour, it used open courts and altars to bring worship into the sun. The relation between these temples and the changing phases of the city is still studied through fragile foundations and scattered blocks. Their surviving ground plans cannot restore every chant, scent, footstep, or gesture. Even so, the contrast they created is plain. Here worship unfolded in brightness, among white surfaces, coloured reliefs, hot stone, drifting incense, and the ceaseless movement of the air. Beyond the central buildings, the new capital spread unevenly. Great residences stood behind enclosure walls with reception halls, gardens, wells, storerooms, kitchens, and smaller houses for dependents. Work areas accumulated near demand. Roads widened where traffic required them and narrowed where houses pressed close. In the desert to the east, tombs were begun for officials who wished to remain near the king in death. Farther into the cliffs, a royal wadi led toward the tomb intended for Akhenaten and his family. The city of visible life was already making room for mortality. Everywhere, the speed of the project left traces. Plans shifted. Walls were altered. Buildings that looked complete from a ceremonial approach might be simpler behind the facade. A capital raised within a reign did not have generations in which to settle gradually into its own shape. It was a place of wet plaster and fresh brick, of quarry dust on clothing, of orders revised as work continued. The impression must have been both magnificent and unfinished. At sunrise, the reason for all this effort would have seemed almost self-evident. Darkness withdrew from the plain. The cliff edges brightened. Then courtyards, pylons, roofs, and painted floors emerged one after another. Offering tables stood ready in the open. The river caught the same light beyond the fields, and the long royal road began to stir. For a few quiet minutes, Akhenaten appeared exactly as its name promised, a horizon made for the Aten. Yet a city is never only the idea proclaimed by its founder. Its avenues had to be swept. Its wells had to be worked. Its ovens had to be fed, its bricks lifted, its accounts balanced, and its dead carried toward the desert. Behind the carved royal family stood many thousands of other lives, drawn into the bay by command, ambition, livelihood, loyalty, or simple dependence. As the fresh colours dried on the palace walls, these people began the harder task of turning a sacred plan into a place where ordinary days could be lived. Mourning in Akhenaten did not begin only with incense and royal hymns. It began with the scrape of a door bolt, the grinding of grain, the stirring of ashes in an oven, and footsteps toward a well. Somewhere a donkey complained beneath its load. Somewhere a child woke in a room still cool from the night. The city may have been founded as the Aten's horizon, but for the tens of thousands thought to have lived there, holiness shared the day with water, bread, work, illness, bargaining, family and fatigue. The remains of their houses reveal a settlement both ordered and improvised. In the principal residential districts, large villas occupied walled compounds. A wealthy official might have received visitors in a broad central hall supported by columns, then withdrawn into more private rooms. Gardens, ponds, granaries, kitchens, stables and chapels could surround the main residence. The house displayed rank, but it also sustained a network. Smaller dwellings clustered nearby for servants, labourers, craftspeople, and dependents whose lives were tied to the estate. Elsewhere, more modest homes pressed together along irregular paths. Rooms were added when a family needed them or when space permitted. Courtyards held ovens and storage jars. Roofs offered a place to work, dry food or find air after the heat of the walls. Furniture was limited for many people. Mats, stools, chests, pottery vessels, baskets and tools. The exact arrangements differed, as households always differ, but the texture of daily need is still visible in hearths, thresholds, worn floors, and broken pots discarded close to home. Water governed the rhythm of the settlement. The Nile lay nearby, yet much of Akhenaten extended onto desert ground beyond the cultivated edge. Wells were essential, and drawing from them demanded repeated labour. Water had to be lifted, carried, stored, and protected from waste. Wealthier compounds might possess their own supply or greater access to carriers. Others depended on shared sources and many journeys. In a city devoted to sunlight, shade and water were quiet forms of privilege. Food moved through similarly unequal channels. Grain came into storerooms, was measured by officials, ground into flour, and baked into the bread that sustained nearly every household. Beer was brewed, vegetables grown where irrigation allowed, and fish, dates, onions, pulses, and occasional meat added variety according to means and season. Royal and temple scenes showed tables bending beneath abundance. For most residents, nourishment was more repetitive and more uncertain. The offering image expressed cosmic plenty. It did not describe every bowl in the city. Akhenaten was also a place of skilled hands. Potters formed vessels for cooking, storage, and ritual. Makers of faience and glass worked with intense colours. Metalworkers, carpenters, leather workers, textile workers, sculptors, painters, and stonecutters supplied a court that demanded constant visual renewal. Fragments from houses and workshops suggest how closely fine production and ordinary residence could stand together. A polished ornament or royal image began amid furnaces, dust, splinters, pigments, and people repeating difficult motions until the object was right. Goods and information converged on the central city. Officials travelled toward offices and storehouses. Petitioners sought attention. Workers delivered supplies. The royal road carried the chariots of the court through this daily circulation, making hierarchy visible in motion. At a ceremonial feature known as the Window of Appearance, the king and royal family could present themselves above a gathered audience and reward favoured servants with gold and honours. Tomb scenes show recipients rejoicing beneath the window, their success represented as a gift flowing from royal hands. Such images tell us what elites wished to remember. They celebrate proximity to the king, loyal service and reward. They do not give us a complete census of feeling below. A labourer watching a procession may have felt awe, hope, indifference, resentment, or several emotions at once. The evidence rarely preserves an ordinary voice speaking plainly about Akhenaten's reforms. Archaeology offers a different kind of testimony. Bodies, houses, tools, meals, repairs, and burials. It is quieter and often more difficult to interpret, but it brings the city's residents nearer. The cemeteries outside Akhetaten have been especially important. Many non-elite people were buried in simple graves in the desert, some wrapped in textile or matting, some placed in modest coffins, sometimes with small personal goods. Excavated skeletons have shown signs of hardship, including interrupted growth, nutritional stress, heavy physical strain, injury, and disease. Many of the people examined died young by modern expectations. Their bones do not resemble the effortless bodies carved beneath the Aten, yet caution is needed here. A cemetery sample is not the whole population, and the people buried in one area may not represent everyone who lived in the city. Skeletal stress can have several causes: rapid construction, demanding labour, crowded conditions, diet, infection, childhood deprivation before arrival, and the ordinary hazards of the ancient world may all have contributed in different proportions. The evidence does not allow us to say that a particular theological decree directly produced a particular illness. It does allow us to see the human cost carried by at least some of those who built and maintained the royal vision. Nor did the new official religion simply enter every house and empty it of older belief. Domestic evidence is uneven, but familiar protective powers did not vanish from private life. Small images and amulets associated with deities concerned with childbirth, danger, health, and the household continued to have meaning. People could honour the Aten in the language expected by the court while still reaching for older forms of protection when a child was ill or a birth approached. Such adaptation was not necessarily an organised rebellion. It was often the way religion lived, through habits, objects, family memory, and need. Burial practice shows a similar mixture of change and persistence. Elite tomb inscriptions at Amarna emphasized the Aten and the king, and traditional references could be reduced or reshaped. Among less wealthy burials, however, bodies were still cared for, wrapped, accompanied, and placed with concern for identity and protection. Some customs continued. Others were simplified, altered, or given new language. The official narrowing of worship was real, but conversion across an entire population cannot be read from royal walls alone. This distinction helps us imagine Akhetaten without flattening its people into believers on one side and victims on the other. A scribe could advance through the new administration and also keep a household charm inherited from his mother. A craft worker could produce Atenist images with extraordinary skill, while understanding the divine world in more familiar ways. A family could watch the royal procession, depend upon temple rations, complain about water, celebrate a marriage, mourn a child, and adapt its prayers to circumstances. Human lives rarely obey the clean boundaries of a program. As evening settled, the city's official brilliance softened. Workshops closed. Smoke from ovens and lamps entered the air. In elite gardens, watered earth released its cool scent. In smaller houses, people gathered in close rooms, while the cliffs darkened beyond them. The Aten disappeared below the western horizon, and whatever theology said about the return of light night restored the private scale of existence. Above these many households stood one household made larger than all others in image and ritual. Its members appeared on temple walls, drove along the royal road, received officials, and offered beneath the rays to the people of Akhetaten. The revolution did not have only a doctrine or a city, it had recognizable faces. Beside Akhenaten, again and again, was the woman whose presence had helped give the new order its visible form, Nefertiti. Nefertiti entered the royal image, not as a figure standing quietly at its edge, but as an active participant beneath the Aten. Her name is often rendered as "the beautiful one has come," and the famous sculpted head found in the workshop of Thutmose has encouraged later ages to treat beauty as the essence of her story. At Akhetaten, however, appearance was only one language of power. The surviving monuments present a queen who offers, worships, rewards, travels, and acts beside the king. She had been prominent from the early years at Thebes, before the new capital existed. As the religious program intensified, her role expanded within its visual world. Nefertiti could stand nearly equal in scale to Akhenaten. She raised offerings to the Aten, shook ritual instruments, and appeared with the king in ceremonies once shaped by older divine relationships. On some early blocks she adopts the violent pose of royal victory, grasping enemies and preparing to strike. The scene is formal and ideological, not evidence for a particular battle, but its grammar matters. A gesture strongly associated with kingship had been placed in the queen's hands. Her crowns made her instantly recognizable. Most distinctive was the tall, flat-topped blue crown that rises in many Amarna scenes, sometimes encircled by a band and fronted with the royal cobra. In other images she wore different headdresses suited to ritual or ceremony. The repeated variation did more than decorate her. Egyptian crowns declared roles, relationships, and forms of authority. Nefertiti's visual identity was being carefully constructed as part of the new sacred order. She also appeared in movement. The royal couple rode in chariots along the road, approached temples, received tribute, and occupied the palace window from which honours flowed to officials below. The Aten's hands reached toward both of them. In some scenes the rays offered signs of life to the king and queen, while their daughters gathered close. The image suggested a circuit. Light descended to the royal family, ritual and offerings returned upward, and life spread outward to the land. That circuit gave Nefertiti genuine ritual prominence. It does not tell us every detail of her political authority. Monumental scale cannot be translated neatly into administrative power, and no archive sets out the private division of decisions between husband and wife. Still, a queen represented so consistently in acts of royal religion cannot be dismissed as ornamental. Whatever conversations have vanished, the public program required her presence. Around the couple were their 6 known daughters. Meritaten, the eldest, appears early and often. Meketaten follows her in the ordered processions of the family, and Ankhesenpaten would later carry the changed world of Amarna into the age of Tutankhamun. The younger princesses bore names closely tied to the Aten: Neferneferoten Tasheret, Neferneferura, and Setapenre. Their births helped fill the walls of the new capital, with a household that was also a theology. The princesses sit on their parents' laps, touch their faces, lean against one another, or shake small instruments in ritual. One child reaches toward Nefertiti's earring. Another is held beneath the sun's descending hands. These gestures feel startlingly intimate beside the formal composure of earlier royal art. They may preserve observation of family affection, but they were never merely private snapshots. Displayed in palaces, tombs, and sacred settings, they made royal closeness a sign of cosmic order. The household became the living image through which the Aten's creative power could be understood. This fusion makes the scenes both tender and difficult to read. We can see a kiss carved in stone, but not the conversation before it. We can see daughters grouped by age, but not recover the ordinary hours of their education, friendships, illnesses, or fears. Their bodies were part of state symbolism from childhood. Even affection, however sincerely felt, entered public theology once it was placed upon a wall. The household extended beyond Nefertiti and her daughters. Queen Tiye, Akhenaten's mother, retained formidable prestige. Images and inscriptions connect her with Akhetaten, and scenes in the tomb of the official Huya show her received within the royal world of her son. She belonged to the previous reign's mature court, diplomacy, and dynastic memory. Her presence joined the supposedly new horizon to the family from which its king had come. Another woman, Kia, appears with titles that mark her as a beloved wife of the king. though not as great royal wife. Her origin, family connections, and fate remain uncertain. Some of her monuments were later altered and reassigned, making an already incomplete record harder to follow. Older attempts to identify her securely as a foreign princess or the mother of a particular royal child go beyond what the surviving evidence can prove. She reminds us that the palace held relationships not fully contained in its most famous family scenes. There were nurses, tutors, attendants, stewards, guards, scribes, and servants as well, each moving through layers of access. Royal children were cared for by people whose names occasionally survive, because service near the household brought status. Offices managed clothing, food, estates, correspondence, ceremonies, and travel. The polished image of family beneath the Aten depended upon an extensive human machinery, mostly kept outside the frame. As Akhenaten's reign advanced, Nefertiti's record becomes harder to interpret. She was once said to have disappeared suddenly after the Middle Years, perhaps through death or disgrace. Discoveries and renewed readings of inscriptions have made that simple story less secure. Evidence suggests that she may have remained great royal wife later than once assumed. Yet, remaining visible and becoming a ruler are different questions, and the damaged sequence of names permits several reconstructions. One of the most elusive royal figures bears the name Nefertiti, a throne name appearing near the end of the Amarna period. Some historians identify this ruler with Nefertiti, perhaps serving as co-regent with Akhenaten or ruling after him. Others reconstruct the evidence differently, separating offices, dates, or identities. Smenkhkara adds another uncertain name to the sequence. Altered cartouches and reused objects do not yield a single uncontested order. For now it is enough to remain with Nefertiti before the record fragments. She stands beneath the open sky in her blue crown, hands lifted in offering, daughters close, the Aten's rays ending around them. The image is composed, abundant, and assured. Beyond its edges, however, lie questions the artists did not answer. Did her authority continue to grow? Did she share the throne under another name? Did she survive Akhenaten, or vanish before the city began to empty? The evidence will lead us back to those questions, but not yet. First, we must listen more closely to the belief that made this household sacred. In a tomb cut into the eastern cliffs, words survive that describe the world waking under sunlight, distant lands breathing, birds rising, and every life renewed. The royal family stands at the centre of that vision. But the light itself travels far beyond palace walls. As evening gathers over Akhenaten, the next path is not toward a throne. It is toward a hymn. The words are carved in the tomb of Ai, one of the senior men of Akhenaten's court, high in the cliffs east of the city. To reach them, we may imagine leaving the last houses behind and climbing into stillness, while the cultivated strip beside the Nile grows narrow in the distance. The chamber was meant for death, yet its longest surviving hymn is filled with awakening. It is usually called the Great Hymn to the Aten, and more than any single text, it allows us to hear the ordered beauty that the new faith wished to reveal. Its movement begins with dawn. The sun rises at the edge of the sky, and the land becomes visible. People wake, wash, dress, and lift their arms. Animals stir. Birds leave their nests, their wings opening toward the light. Boats begin to travel along the river, while fish move below its shining surface. Fields grow, trees and plants receive life. The language gathers many separate motions into one quiet rhythm, as though the whole created world were breathing with the passage of the sun. When the Aten sets, that rhythm changes. Darkness covers the earth, movement slows, and people lie down unable to see beyond the small enclosure of sleep. The night is described not as another divine realm governed by a family of gods, but as an absence of the visible power on which life depends. At sunrise, order returns. The roads open again, labour resumes, and every creature seems to take up its proper place. Creation is therefore not only an event in a remote beginning, it is renewed each morning. This daily renewal gives the hymn its remarkable breadth. The Aten sustains the child before birth and gives breath to the chick within the shell. It makes the Nile in Egypt, yet it also provides for peoples beyond the Nile Valley. Foreign lands have their own speech, appearance, and ways of life, but all stand beneath the same sun. Rain falls far away where the Egyptian river cannot reach. Syria, Nubia, and other lands are not described simply as shadows beyond the ordered world. They too live by the light. There is something spacious in this vision. No temple roof can contain the sun, and no city boundary can stop its rays. From Akhetaten, the mind is invited to travel across deserts and harbours, cultivated valleys and distant hills, watching one source of life touch them all. In this sense, the hymn reaches beyond the older local attachments of Egyptian worship. The Aten is not merely the god of one town. Its action is presented as universal, continuous, and immediately visible. Yet universal light did not mean universal access. The same theology that embraced every living thing also drew religious knowledge tightly around the king. Akhenaten claimed a unique understanding of the Aten, and the hymns repeatedly placed him beside the god as the one who knew its purposes. Nefertiti and the royal daughters shared the sacred image, receiving rays and presenting offerings, but ordinary worshippers usually approached this divine order through the royal household. The sun touched every face. Its authorized meaning travelled through the throne. This is one of the central tensions of Akhenaten's revolution. The Aten could be described without the old divine biographies, quarrels, marriages, and animal forms. Its proof shone overhead each day. But the apparent simplicity of visible light supported an intensely concentrated structure of power in temple reliefs. The Aten extends life toward Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The royal couple then sustains the world through offerings and rule. The new faith did not remove mediation. It made royal mediation more exclusive. For those accustomed to the many pathways of traditional religion, the change reached beyond public ceremony. Egyptian ideas of death had long drawn strength from Osiris, lord of the underworld, from spells of protection, and from the hope that the dead might be renewed through identification with divine stories. Tombs contained images and words designed to help a person pass through danger and join a lasting order. During the Amarna years, much of this familiar sacred geography receded from official royal expression. Osiris was diminished, and the old map of the night was no longer given its former prominence. What replaced it is not always easy to reconstruct. Elite tombs at Akhetaten focus strongly on the king, the palace, and the Aten's daylight worship. The tomb owner might be shown receiving favour from the royal family, praising the Aten, or standing near the window of appearance. Continued existence seemed closely connected to loyal participation in the order created by Akhenaten. Some texts suggest that the dead might awaken with the dawn, leave the tomb, and remain near the temples where offerings were made. But the evidence does not provide a complete new account equal in detail to the older journeys through the underworld. That silence may have felt serene to some and deeply uncertain to others. The hymn is confident about life beneath the sun, but far less expansive about what happens when sunlight is gone. Its attention rests on breath, growth, birth, food, movement, and the recurring morning. It celebrates the world that can be seen. For a living court gathered beneath open skies, this was a radiant assurance. For a family preparing a burial, the narrowed horizon may have raised questions the surviving inscriptions do not answer. Modern readers have often heard an echo between the great hymn and later religious poetry, especially a biblical psalm that also praises divine provision for animals, plants, people, and the ordered cycle of day and night. The resemblance is worth noticing. Both works draw from experiences shared across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East: sunlight, darkness, nesting birds, lions at night, ships on water, and life sustained by a creator. Ideas and literary forms did travel between cultures over long centuries. But resemblance is not a line of descent. No surviving evidence shows that a writer of the biblical text read I's tomb inscription, possessed a copy of the hymn, or received it through a traceable chain of transmission. The works arose in different languages, settings, and theological worlds, separated by time. A direct influence remains possible to imagine, but it cannot be presented as established history. The careful answer is quieter. Human beings in neighbouring ancient cultures could look at the same natural rhythms and shape them into praise, sometimes in strikingly similar ways. Within I's tomb, then, the hymn remains first of all an Amarna document. It expresses a court's hope that all variety might be gathered beneath one source of life, while placing Akhenaten at the centre of that gathering. Dawn comes to everyone, but the royal family interprets the dawn. Foreign lands receive rain and breath, but their rulers still appear elsewhere in the archive, as negotiators, rivals, and petitioners before Egypt. And so the light leads us out of the tomb and back down toward the administrative quarter. There, in rooms once crowded with scribes, the world beyond Akhetaten did not appear as a serene landscape awakening together. It arrived on clay, kings asking for gold, vassals reporting danger, messengers delayed on long roads, and distant courts measuring every gift. Beneath the hymn's universal sky, an empire was still speaking. Its voices survive in small tablets, impressed with wedge-shaped signs and then hardened by time. They were found among the remains of Akhetaten's administrative buildings, where trained scribes had once read, translated, copied, and stored messages from abroad. The language was mostly Akkadian, written in cuneiform, the shared diplomatic medium of courts whose own spoken languages could be very different. In an Egyptian capital devoted to a newly narrowed vision of divinity, the international office remained patiently multilingual. The collection is known as the Amarna Letters, although it is not a complete archive, and not all of it belongs to Akhenaten alone. Some correspondence reaches back into the reign of Amenhotep III. Some belongs to the transition between father and son. Other tablets are difficult to place precisely. What happened to the missing letters is unknown. They may have been carried away when the court left, destroyed, reused, or simply lost in rooms that have not survived. What remains is a broken conversation, vivid precisely because we can hear only certain voices. At its highest level, diplomacy took the form of a family. The rulers of Egypt, Babylonia, Mitanni, Hatti, and, increasingly, Assyria addressed one another as brothers. The word suggested equality among great kings, but their letters reveal constant calculation beneath the courtesy. They compared gifts, questioned delays, negotiated royal marriages, and guarded their rank. A ruler might complain that the gold sent from Egypt was less than expected, or remind Pharaoh that gold in his land was said to be as plentiful as dust. Polite language could carry a very sharp edge. Gifts were not casual tokens. Gold, precious vessels, fine cloth, horses, chariots, and crafted objects moved between courts as visible measures of relationship. Royal women also entered these exchanges through marriages arranged across great distances, though Egyptian kings were notably reluctant to send their own daughters abroad. Messengers could spend months or years away from home. Their safety, reception, and return mattered, and every apparent slight invited another tablet. Prestige was maintained through repetition. A gift received, a gift answered, a bond renewed. These letters show that Akhetaten was never sealed from the wider world. Foreign envoys crossed its roads. Scribes trained in an old international system worked within its offices. The palace that staged offerings beneath the Aten also weighed requests from Babylon and Mitanni, and watched the changing strength of Hatti and Assyria. Even as official theology at home rejected many inherited forms, diplomatic practice continued in conventions far older than the new city. Below the great kings stood the rulers of smaller cities in Canaan and Syria, lands where Egyptian influence depended on local alliances, garrisons, tribute, and personal loyalty. Their letters often begin with elaborate submission. A city ruler casts himself at Pharaoh's feet, again and again, calling himself dust beneath the king's sandals. The formula sounds absolute. The message that follows is usually urgent: send archers, recognize my loyalty, distrust my rival, rescue my city. One of the most persistent voices is Rib-Hadda of Byblos, who wrote repeatedly as his position weakened and his enemies gained ground. Elsewhere, Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem defended himself against accusations and described threats around his territory. Aziru of Amuru offered explanations while pursuing his own ambitions. Other rulers blamed neighbours, denied betrayal, and presented local struggles as dangers to Egypt itself. Each hoped that the distant court would see the region through his eyes. The tablets also mention groups called the Habiru, but the term should be handled carefully. It does not offer a simple reference to a single ethnic people, and it cannot be quietly turned into a familiar biblical name. In these letters, it seems to describe shifting people on the margins of settled authority, perhaps including mercenaries, dependents, refugees, or rebels depending on the place and moment. Like much in the archive, the word records anxiety more clearly than it records a neat identity. From such petitions grew one of the most enduring judgments against Akhenaten, that while he composed hymns and built temples, he ignored an empire slipping away. It is an attractive picture because it joins religious obsession to political failure in a single scene. But the evidence does not allow so easy a verdict. A preserved plea for help does not prove that no answer came. The archive contains incoming mail more readily than a complete record of Egyptian decisions, dispatched forces, oral instructions, or messages carried on materials that decayed. Nor were the letter writers detached observers. They were political actors using alarm to win resources and defeat rivals. A ruler who claimed that everything would be lost without Egyptian archers had reason to make danger sound immediate. Some requests may indeed have gone unanswered. Some regions plainly faced severe instability, and Hittite expansion transformed the balance of power in Syria. Yet historians continue to debate the degree of Egyptian decline during Akhenaten's reign, the timing of particular losses, and how much responsibility belongs to policies made at Akhenaten. The image that emerges is neither a perfectly managed empire, nor a court wholly indifferent to the horizon. It is a system under strain, operating through incomplete knowledge and long delays. A tablet had to be composed, carried across difficult country, received, interpreted, discussed, and answered. By the time help arrived, alliances might already have shifted. Pharaoh's power was immense, but distance made every command slower and less certain. There may also have been choices that the tablets only hint at. Egypt could not respond equally to every quarrel among its dependents, and intervention in one city might threaten relations with another. Maintaining access, tribute, and strategic routes did not always require preserving every local ruler. To call restraint neglect assumes that we know what the court intended. Often we do not. We see the requests fragments of negotiation, and the results unevenly preserved. Still, the letters carry a gathering unease. Old partners sought reassurance. New powers tested their standing. Local rulers watched neighbours change sides. The world celebrated by the hymn as one creation beneath the Aten was politically divided, full of borders, rival households, and uncertain roads. Universal sunlight did not dissolve the ambitions of kings. In the records office, scribes continued to press those ambitions into damp clay. Then, at some point, the correspondence stopped. The tablets remained behind as the royal city moved toward abandonment, scattered across floors where shelves and baskets had vanished. Their silence does not tell us exactly why the system faltered. It tells us only that the conversation was interrupted. And while foreign rulers asked what Egypt would do, uncertainty was entering the palace itself. Names began to fade or change. Familiar figures appeared less often or under altered titles. In the royal tomb beyond the city, artists carved not the assurance of dawn, but a family bent in grief. The light remained above them. Within the household, however, shadows were lengthening. The most painful surviving image belongs to Meketaten, the second daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, in a chamber of the royal tomb. The young princess lies beneath a canopy. Her parents stand nearby, their bodies drawn into gestures of mourning. Akhenaten reaches toward her. Nefertiti raises a hand to her face. Other members of the household crowd behind them, and the rays of the Aten descend into a room where divine light has not prevented death. The scene is damaged, but its grief is unmistakable. Egyptian royal art had long known ritual mourning, yet here the elongated Amarna bodies make sorrow seem almost physical. Arms extend, shoulders bend, and hands rise in helpless motion. The family that had been presented in temples as the living centre of creation is shown gathered around an absence. For a moment, public theology and private loss occupy the same wall. We do not know precisely when or why Meketaten died. The event is often placed around the later years of Akhenaten's reign, and some interpretations connect it with ceremonies shown in the tomb. A nearby image of an infant with a nurse has encouraged the suggestion that Meketaten died in childbirth. That reading has never been secure. The arrangement may refer to another child, another death, or a symbolic and ritual sequence we no longer understand. Her age is itself reconstructed rather than recorded in a modern biography. The stone gives us mourning, not a medical report. Other daughters also become difficult to follow. Princesses who once appeared beneath the Aten's rays do not all remain visible through the last years at Akhetaten. This has led some historians to wonder whether disease moved through the royal household and perhaps through the city beyond it. The wider eastern Mediterranean and Near East did know episodes of epidemic illness in this broad era, and later Hittite texts remember a devastating plague. It is tempting to join these fragments into a single disaster reaching Egypt. But temptation is not evidence. No surviving inscription identifies an epidemic at Akhetaten as the cause of Meketaten's death, and skeletal traces of sickness rarely provide the exact names or dates we would need. Several deaths within a family can suggest infection, but they can also reflect the ordinary dangers of pregnancy, childhood, injury, and disease in the ancient world. The epidemic remains a hypothesis, possible, perhaps illuminating, but unproven. Beyond the royal tomb, the city's cemeteries reveal lives already burdened by poor nutrition, strenuous labour, and physical stress. Those findings remind us that illness and early death did not begin only when royal images turned mournful. Yet they do not permit us to diagnose the palace from the graves of the wider population. The bodies of ordinary residents tell one difficult history. The damaged relief of Meketaten tells another. We may place them beside each other without forcing them into the same cause. Kia's story is even more fragmentary. She appears in surviving objects and inscriptions with distinctive titles, close to the king but never carrying Nefertiti's full rank as great royal wife. Her monuments suggest real favour and a recognised place within the royal household. Then her image and name become less visible. On some objects her inscriptions were altered or reassigned to royal daughters. Such changes may reflect death, a shift in status, a reordering of memory, or the practical reuse of expensive royal work. They do not prove the dramatic fall from favour that later imagination sometimes supplies. Kia has also been drawn into attempts to identify the mothers of royal children and the owners of unnamed remains. These reconstructions can be ingenious, combining titles, reused coffins, genetic claims, and damaged portraits. But each uncertain piece makes the next conclusion more fragile. The surviving record does not allow Kia to be turned confidently into a hidden queen, a disgraced rival, or the answer to every missing relationship. She remains important, partly because she reveals how much of palace life has disappeared. Nefertiti's later path is better documented than Kia's, and yet no less disputed. Older accounts often said that she vanished suddenly, perhaps through death, disgrace, or retreat from public life. Later attestations make that simple disappearance less secure. They suggest continued visibility and perhaps increasing authority, but they do not reveal a continuous sequence of offices or events. A damaged date or altered title can support very different reconstructions. That is the larger difficulty with the late royal household. A person might bear several names and titles. A cartouche could be recut, and an object prepared for one owner could be adapted for another. Later restoration and erasure removed precisely the signs that might have linked one phase to the next. Near the same darkness stand Nefertiti and Smenkhare, names too fragmentary to arrange securely here. Whether Nefertiti was connected to one of those royal identities, and how any shared or successive rule unfolded, remains open. For now, the names show only that authority around Akhenaten was changing even as the record lost its clarity. For the people of Akhetaten, however, uncertainty would not have been an abstract puzzle. The city depended upon the presence of its founding king and the sacred household around him. Offices, temples, food distributions, careers and loyalties all flowed toward that centre. A death among the princesses was personal sorrow, religious disturbance, and political warning at once. If the identities and ranks near the throne were changing, thousands of lives beyond the palace could feel the movement without knowing its cause. The contrast with the city's beginning is gentle but profound. Akhetaten had risen in fresh plaster and bright paint, defined by a confident oath and an open horizon. Now the royal tomb held scenes of mourning. Kia's inscriptions were being reassigned. Nefertiti's role seemed to change as the record thinned. Foreign letters carried unease, and familiar names no longer stood in a clear order beneath the sun. Still, the Aten rose each morning over the eastern cliffs. Light crossed the great temple's courts, touched the offering tables, and entered houses where ordinary routines continued. Scribes sharpened reeds, bakers stirred embers, water carriers walked from wells. A city can continue to move while the structure holding it together begins to weaken. The change is not always visible at once. Near the end of Akhenaten's reign, this is how the evidence meets us, not with one final catastrophe, but with a series of absences. A daughter mourned, a favoured woman obscured, a queen perhaps transformed, royal names overlapping in broken inscriptions. We can sense the household narrowing around the king, yet we cannot confidently arrange everyone who stood beside him. Soon the uncertainty will reach Akhenaten himself. His last securely known years approach, and beyond them lie a damaged tomb, contested burials, brief rulers, and a boy whose name still honoured the Aten. But for a little longer, the desert city remains inhabited beneath its brilliant sky, carrying grief through sunlit rooms, and waiting for a future no inscription clearly foretells. The future arrived quietly in the surviving record. The highest year that can be assigned securely to Akhenaten is his 17th. By then, the king who had once filled whole walls with declarations of renewal had become strangely difficult to see. A dated inscription gives us a final foothold, and then the path breaks apart. There is no preserved account of his last illness, no reliable description of his final day, and no court chronicle telling us who stood beside him when he died. Even the season remains uncertain. We know only that, sometime soon after that last attested year, the central figure of the Aten's world was gone. His death exposed a weakness that had always been present within the new order. The Aten shone over every land, according to the royal hymns, but the institutions that interpreted that light had been built closely around one household and one king. Akhenaten was not simply the cult's chief worshipper. In official images, he was the indispensable link through which the Aten's blessings reached the world. Unlike the older cults, Atenism did not rest upon a centuries-old network of local sanctuaries and inherited ritual traditions. Once the royal link was broken, the system had little institutional depth independent of the court to hold it steady. The royal tomb had been cut into a remote valley east of Akhetaten, where the cliffs draw close around a dry and silent floor. Its chambers were decorated with scenes unlike the older royal tombs of Thebes. Here, too, the royal family lived beneath the rays of the Aten. Here the Princess Mekhetaten had been mourned. Akhenaten appears to have intended this place for his own burial, in accordance with the oath carved upon the boundary stele. Fragments of royal burial equipment and a shattered stone sarcophagus suggest that funerary preparations were made, and perhaps completed. Yet the tomb does not offer a peaceful ending. It was entered, damaged and robbed. Images were attacked. The sarcophagus was broken. At some point, a royal body may have been removed, perhaps when the court abandoned the city and traditional burial grounds again became desirable. But the evidence cannot tell us with confidence whether Akhenaten rested there for years, for months, or only in intention. The empty rooms preserve an absence rather than an answer. Far away in the Valley of the Kings, another mystery has often been drawn into the story. The badly disturbed burial known as KV-55 contained a royal mummy objects carrying several Amarna period names and a coffin altered in antiquity. Some scientific studies have supported a close family relationship between this individual and Tutankhamun, and many scholars have argued that the body may be Akhenaten's. Others have questioned the estimated age at death, the interpretation of the genetic results, and the way the mixed burial was assembled. Smenkhkare has also been proposed. The identification remains contested. It is tempting to place a familiar name upon any silent body, but the evidence asks us to leave this one partly unnamed. The rulers who stood between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun are no easier to arrange. A king called Smenkhkare appears briefly, associated with the royal family, and perhaps with Akhenaten as a co-regent, though the nature and duration of that role are uncertain. Another royal name, Nefertiti, belongs to a ruler whose titles and altered inscriptions have inspired many reconstructions. Some historians identify this sovereign with Nefertiti in a new kingly role. Others have proposed Meritaten or another member of the court. The fragments do not settle the matter, and even the order in which Smenkhkare and Nefertiti ruled is debated. These were not empty academic puzzles in their own time. Behind each changing cartouche stood control of the palace, the treasury, the army, and the ritual order of Egypt. A brief co-regency could provide continuity. A new royal identity could protect a vulnerable succession. A marriage might connect one claim to another. Yet the names have been erased, reassigned, or preserved only in incomplete forms, so modern certainty would create a smooth story where the ancient record remains rough. Out of that roughness emerged a boy king. He first bore the name Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. He was probably still a child when he came to the throne, surrounded by experienced courtiers, military leaders, scribes, and priests who understood how much had been unsettled. He married Ankhesenpaten, one of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters. Their names bound the young couple to the city and to the divine disk above it. But the wider country beyond Akhetaten had not forgotten its older gods. The pressure upon the new reign need not be imagined as one dramatic confrontation. Egypt's traditional temples had managed land, workshops, offerings, festivals, and local loyalties for generations. Their neglect or suppression had disturbed far more than religious language. To reconcile with them was to reopen institutions through which communities understood both divine favour and ordinary order. The court also needed a form of kingship that could survive beyond Akhenaten's singular vision, under a child that need must have felt especially sharp, though the private debates behind the decision are lost. Akhetaten did not vanish on the morning after its founder died. Lamps were still lit in houses. Grain was still ground. Potters, soldiers, and scribes did not become shadows merely because the sequence of kings had grown uncertain. Some official activity continued, and some people remained after the royal household began to turn elsewhere. Abandonment is rarely one clean moment. A family may leave while its neighbour waits. A workshop may close after its supplies stop arriving. A temple court may stand swept for a season, before wind gathers sand against its walls. But the city had been created by royal will, and royal absence slowly withdrew the force that sustained it. Administrative offices lost their purpose. Estates no longer sent the same stream of goods toward the Aten's tables. Elite houses were emptied, their painted rooms left to dust and insects. Portable valuables travelled with departing owners. Heavier things were abandoned, broken, or taken apart. Mud brick walls began to soften beneath rare rain and relentless weather. The long royal road, once animated by chariots and public appearances, grew quieter. The young king's court moved back toward Egypt's older centres, closer to Memphis, Thebes, and the institutions that had endured the experiment. In time, Tutankhaten himself would take a different name. The change would declare that the living image of the Aten had become the living image of Amun. Yet even then, the reversal would not be completed in a single decree. Akhenaten's revolution had taken years to sharpen, and the answer to it would also unfold in stages. In the desert bay, the sun continued to rise exactly as the hymn had promised. It touched the cliffs, entered the open courts, and illuminated offering tables, from which the offerings were disappearing. The light had not failed. The human world built around it had begun to unravel. And as the last royal servants departed from Akhetaten, Egypt prepared not merely to leave Akhenaten behind, but to reshape the memory of what he had done. The first reshaping came through restoration. During the young king's reign, Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, and Ankhesenpaten became Ankhesenamun. A few syllables were enough to announce an immense change. Amun, whose name had been cut from monuments under Akhenaten, now returned within the names of the royal couple themselves. The court moved away from Akhetaten, and the old religious centres again became the visible foundations of kingship. Temples were repaired. Divine images were renewed. Priests and ritual servants were appointed. Lands restored. Workshops supplied, and offerings once more directed toward gods whose cults had been diminished. Amun was central to this recovery, but the reversal was broader than the return of one deity. Ptah at Memphis, the gods of Thebes, and the many local powers of Egypt resumed their places within a sacred landscape that had always been plural, layered, and deeply rooted in particular towns. One of the clearest official voices of this moment survives on the monument usually called the Restoration Stela. Set up in Tutankhamun's name, it describes a country in which the temples had fallen into disorder, sanctuaries had become neglected, and the gods no longer answered the people. It then presents the young king as the one who rebuilt their houses, fashioned their images, enriched their offerings, and returned ritual life to its proper course. The stela is valuable evidence, but it is also royal speech. Egyptian kings commonly describe the time before their rule as disorder, and their own actions as the return of balance. The language magnifies ruin, so that restoration may appear more complete. It does not provide a neutral survey of every temple in Egypt, and it cannot tell us that all traditional worship had ceased among ordinary people. Indeed, the private objects and burial customs found at Akhetaten suggests that familiar divine relationships had continued even within the revolutionary capital. What the stela does reveal is the new court's chosen explanation. The troubles of the recent past could be understood as the result of neglecting the gods. The remedy was not simply administrative, it was cosmic. By repairing temples and renewing offerings, Tutankhamun's government claimed to restore Maat, the fragile rightness that joined divine, natural, and human order, for a child king whose right to rule emerged from a confused succession. This was a powerful language of legitimacy. The decision was likely shaped by senior figures around the young king, though their precise shares remain unclear. An experienced courtier who had served during the Amarna years, stood close to the throne. Horemheb, a military commander, gained power in the same unsettled world. Priests, officials, estate managers, and provincial elites all had reason to welcome institutions on which their livelihoods and authority depended. Yet it would be too simple to imagine that they formed one secret party waiting to destroy Akhenaten. Many had adapted to his reign, and some now adapted again. Survival often wears the clothing of conviction without allowing us to separate the two. Tutankhamun's reign was brief. He died around the threshold of adulthood, leaving no surviving child to secure the line. Then took the throne for a few years, and continued the restored forms of kingship. After him came Horemheb, who presented himself as the ruler who had brought order after confusion. With Horemheb, the treatment of the Amarna age became more systematic. Monuments were appropriated, names were replaced. Recent predecessors could be bypassed as though lawful time had flowed directly from Amenhotep III to the new regime. Even this was not the final form of erasure. Later rulers of the 19th dynasty inherited both the political need to distance themselves from the religious experiment and the practical remains of its buildings. Official king lists could omit Akhenaten and the brief rulers who followed him. In some later language, Akhenaten became a condemned figure, remembered indirectly as a rebel or enemy associated with Akhetaten. His reign was no longer a chapter to honour but a wound over which royal history could be closed. The campaign reached beyond words. At Thebes, the enormous Aten structures raised early in Akhenaten's reign were dismantled. Their small sandstone blocks, the talatat, were convenient to carry and easy to reuse. Workmen pulled apart walls that had once displayed the king, Nefertiti, the princesses, offerings and rays ending in delicate hands. The blocks were then packed into the interiors of later pylons, gateways and foundations, especially during the building programs of Horemheb and the Ramesside kings. To the builders this was both destruction and useful quarrying. Cut stone carried value, and a discredited monument offered an enormous supply already shaped to size. Some faces were attacked before reuse, other scenes were simply broken into fragments by the act of dismantling. A queen's crown might be separated from her body. A sun ray might lie upside down beside part of an offering table. Words that had once formed a hymn could disappear into the dark core of a wall where no worshipper would ever see them. And there, strangely, they were protected. Exposed monuments weather. Their surfaces are scraped, burned by sun, recut by later rulers, or carried away across centuries. Many talatats survived because they had been hidden as fill inside newer architecture. When modern workers and archaeologists later encountered them, the lost walls could not be rebuilt perfectly. But individual scenes could be photographed, compared, and sometimes joined like pieces of a vast stone puzzle. The effort to make Akhenaten's images invisible had preserved thousands of fragments from the open air. At Akhetaten itself, abandonment did much of the work that chisels began elsewhere. The palaces and temples were stripped of useful stone, timber, and fittings. Mud brick collapsed. Desert sand crossed floors where painted plaster slowly broke away. Nearby communities continued to live in the region, and parts of the site were used in later periods. but the royal city ceased to be the centre for which it had been designed. Its sacred boundary remained carved in the cliffs, while the settlement within it returned gradually to ruin. The process was neither immediate nor uniform. Akhenaten's names had already been attacked in some places before later dynasties broadened the condemnation. Tutankhamun restored older cults but may not have launched every act later associated with the reaction. Horemheb claimed monuments belonging to Tutankhamun and I, and official forgetting eventually swept over several rulers, not Akhenaten alone. The Ramesside kings continued the work of omission, appropriation, and dismantling decades after the Aten city had begun to empty. This matters because the familiar picture of one furious command issued throughout Egypt on a single day is too neat. Erasure was a sequence of choices. Some were theological, intended to repair what later rulers regarded as an offence against the gods. Some were political, clearing a broken succession from the royal line. Some were economic, turning abandoned stone into new walls. Some were acts of usurpation by kings who wanted another ruler's labour to bear their own name. Together, over decades, they produced the deep silence that would surround Akhenaten. There is a quiet symmetry in that silence. Akhenaten had ordered the name of Amun removed from monuments, even from the names of earlier kings where his agents could reach them. Later Egypt answered in the same sacred language. To damage a name was not merely to criticize a dead ruler. In Egyptian thought, name, image, body, and memory helped sustain existence beyond death. A chisel striking a cartouche could therefore become an argument about who deserved to remain within the ordered universe. Yet no erasure is complete. A name may be cut away, while the outline of its signs remains. A city may be deserted while its rubbish, graves, roads, and house walls wait beneath the sand. A monument may disappear, while its stones sleep inside another king's gate. Akhenaten was removed from the honoured sequence of rulers, but the physical traces of his reign were too numerous and too deeply buried to vanish. Centuries passed. The cliffs kept the damaged boundary stele. The royal tomb kept its broken chambers. The later pylons kept their concealed blocks. What had been condemned to darkness was not destroyed so much as scattered, and in time those scattered pieces would begin to speak again. They returned slowly, without any single moment of revelation. Travellers copied signs from the cliffs. Surveyors traced the wide, faint shape of a city whose streets had almost dissolved into the desert. Archaeologists entered houses, temples, tombs, and workshops, recovering not a complete history but countless fragments of one. Each discovery made the silence around Akhenaten a little less secure. Among the most remarkable finds were clay tablets from the Ancient Records Office, brought to attention in the late 19th century after local people encountered them at the site. Written mainly in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age, the Amarna letters reopened a world far beyond the desert capital. Kings complained about gifts. Vassals accused their rivals. Messengers crossed long roads between Egypt and the courts of Western Asia. The tablets did not settle every argument about Akhenaten's foreign policy, but they restored voices that official Egyptian memory had not preserved. Excavation revealed the city at a more intimate scale. Floors retained traces of colour. Workshops held abandoned tools and unfinished objects. Rubbish deposits preserved the ordinary materials of cooking, craft, and administration. Cemeteries brought attention back to labourers and families whose bodies carried the strain of life in the royal experiment. Akhenaten was no longer only the stage for a strange king. It became a place inhabited by thousands of people whose choices, hardships, and devotions complicated the old tale of a population instantly converted by command. In 1912, excavators working in the remains of the sculptor Thutmose's workshop found the painted bust of Nefertiti. Its survival gave the queen a modern afterlife of extraordinary power. Yet its calm beauty can mislead if it separates her from the demanding political and ritual world in which she lived. She was not merely a face from a vanished court. She had stood beneath the Aten's rays as a partner in offerings, royal display, and the theology of the ruling family. Her final position, like so much at Amarna, remains open to debate. The Talatat offered another kind of return. Blocks hidden within later monuments emerged bearing portions of bodies, crowns, hands, food, inscriptions and sunlight. Scholars photographed and catalogued them, then sought relationships among fragments separated when the Aten temples were torn apart. The resulting reconstructions are necessarily incomplete. Still, they allow lost walls to appear in outline, and they show how much evidence survived precisely because later builders buried it. Modern science has added new questions as often as answers. Mummies have been scanned, compared and tested. Family relationships have been proposed. Ages and identities have been revised, challenged, and revised again. These methods can narrow possibilities, but damaged remains, mixed burials, and uncertain historical assumptions prevent a final certainty in every case. The desire to announce that Akhenaten himself has been found is understandable. The more faithful response is quieter, perhaps, but not proven beyond dispute. The same restraint belongs to his larger legacy. He is sometimes called the first monotheist, yet that title can make a complex Egyptian theology sound more settled than it was. The Aten may have become the only god officially acknowledged at the centre of royal worship, but scholars continue to debate how best to describe the system and how deeply it shaped belief beyond the court. Akhenaten did not invent the sun, the solar disk, or every idea expressed in the hymns. He intensified older currents until they became a radical program of exclusion. Was he a visionary who imagined divine life as light falling equally upon all lands? An authoritarian who narrowed worship around himself and damaged traditions that gave meaning to others? A theologian, an iconoclast, an artist king, or a ruler whose experiment could not survive his death? Each portrait catches something in the evidence, but none contains the whole man. The records reveal public acts on a vast scale, while withholding the private mind that chose them. Perhaps that is why Akhenaten remains so compelling. His reign brings together beauty and severity, tenderness in royal family scenes and violence against sacred names, universal language and tightly controlled access, startling creativity and deep disruption. It refuses the comfort of a single verdict. Even the revolution's failure was not simple. Older institutions returned, but Egyptian art and kingship could not make the Amarna years entirely unreal. Too many traces remained beneath the official silence. And so we come back to the damaged names in the moonlight. The chisel marks are still there. They tell us that memory in ancient Egypt was not passive. It could be granted, revised, stolen, or defended in stone. Akhenaten had tried to diminish Amun's presence by cutting away the god's name. Later rulers turned that same logic against him. Each side understood that what is spoken and seen may endure, while what is left unnamed drifts toward a second death. But the erased king did not disappear. His broken city preserved the shape of his ambition. His enemies preserved pieces of his temples inside their own. A queen's painted face waited in a workshop. Letters slept in clay. The desert held outlines that patient hands would one day follow again. Now evening settles once more over Amarna. The cliffs darken first, then the open plain. Wind moves softly through rooms without roofs, across the royal road, and past the offering courts where sunlight once stood at the centre of the world. Nothing here gives us a final judgment. Only fragments, and the space between them. Perhaps that is enough. History does not always return the people whom power tried to erase as they truly were. Sometimes it returns their questions. What can faith become when joined to absolute authority? How much of a world can one ruler remake? And who controls the memory that remains when the monuments fall silent? Thank you for spending this quiet journey beneath the Aten's fading rays. If it brought a little calm, you may gently like the video and subscribe for more histories told at this slower hour. And if you are still awake, you are warmly invited to leave a comment with the place from which you have been listening, or with the part of Akhenaten's story that stayed with you. For now, let the desert grow still. Let the broken names rest beneath the stars, no longer entirely forgotten, and may the night ahead be peaceful.